The sky over Warsaw, August 1944. A city is dying. The Polish Home Army has risen against its Nazi occupiers, and the German response is not just war, it is extermination. But amidst the rubble and the smoke, a new sound emerges. It is not the clean mechanical clatter of a Wehrmacht assault. It is not the disciplined advance of an elite panzer division. It is something else. It is the sound of drunken screams, of random wild bursts from machine guns, the sound of doors being kicked in, followed by the shrieks of women and children. It is the sound of absolute inhuman chaos. A German general, horrified, sends a frantic message back to high command. He is not witnessing a battle. He is witnessing a carnival of murder. They are, he reports, driving herds of naked women and children into burning buildings. They are butchering civilians and patients in hospitals. The terrified citizens of Warsaw call them the devils. The German army soldiers watching from their own lines call them the swine. They are the SS Sonderkommando Derlawanger. This is not the story of soldiers. It is the story of a nightmare given form. A story of how the Third Reich, in a desperate quest to solve an unsolvable problem, deliberately unleashed a weapon made of pure human evil. This is the story of the one unit that even other SS officers feared. The story of Hitler's personal pack of butchers. To understand the creation of a monster, one must first understand the laboratory. The Eastern Front, 1941. Operation Barbarossa has shattered the Red Army. The Wehrmacht charges toward Moscow. Victorious, arrogant, and blind. Because behind their front lines a new war is beginning, a shadow war. In the vast primordial forests and impenetrable swamps of Belarus and Ukraine, an area historians would later call the Bloodlands, tens of thousands of cut-off Soviet soldiers and enraged locals melt into the trees. They become partisans. This was not a conventional army. It was a phantom menace. They did not fight in regiments. They fought with the mine, the ambush, and the garrote wire. They struck German supply lines, which were already stretched impossibly thin over the vast Russian landscape. They assassinated German officials and executed local collaborators. They turned the entire German rear area, a space the size of France, into a lethal, unpredictable killing zone. The German response was immediate and it was brutal. But it was also conventional, the Wehrmacht. The regular army was simply not equipped for this. Their blitzkrieg tactics, their panzer divisions, their sweeping envelopments, they were useless here. You cannot encircle a ghost. You cannot bomb a swamp. A general named Max von Schenkendorf, in charge of the Army Group Center rear area, tried to apply standard military doctrine. He established security divisions. But these were low-quality troops, older men, and reservists who were terrified of the very forest they were supposed to be pacifying. They responded with collective reprisals. A bridge is blown. The nearest village is burned. A German soldier is shot. 100 civilians are rounded up and hanged in the public square. This was the Wehrmacht's standard horrific procedure. But this terror, which may have worked in the occupied cities of France, had the opposite catastrophic effect in Belarus. It did not create fear. It created rage. It did not create order. It created more partisans. For every civilian the Wehrmacht executed, 2 more took up arms and fled into the woods. The German war on terror was becoming the partisans' greatest recruitment tool. The German command was frustrated. They were losing men, material, and control. The Wehrmacht was failing. The Einsatzgruppen, the SS death squads, were busy with their own horrific mission of genocide against the Jewish population. They were ideological killers, not counterinsurgency specialists. They were designed to round up and shoot unarmed men, women, and children, not to hunt armed combatants in a forest. This failure created a power vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped the most sinister figure in the Third Reich, Heinrich Himmler. As Reichsherr of the SS, Himmler saw this partisan problem as a personal challenge. He was obsessed with unconventional warfare, with ideological purity, and with proving that his SS, his Black Order, was superior to the old-fashioned Prussian generals of the Wehrmacht whom he despised. He believed that conventional soldiers were failing because they were still bound, however loosely, by rules, by discipline, by a shred of military tradition. To fight in the shadows, Himmler argued, you cannot send a soldier. You must send a hunter, someone who already thrives in the darkness, someone who feels no restraint, no pity, and no fear of the law. Himmler called this new doctrine Bandenbeck-Mapfang, literally bandit fighting. The term itself was a stroke of evil bureaucratic genius. by calling them bandits instead of partisans. He linguistically stripped them of any legal protection under the Geneva Convention. They were not enemy soldiers. They were common criminals, vermin, and they could be dealt with by any means necessary. But Himmler needed a new kind of unit. He did not just want ideologically motivated SS men from the Totenkopf or Das Reich divisions. He wanted something else. He wanted men who enjoyed the cruelty, men who saw the chaos of the East not as a grim duty but as a playground. The problem is an army is built on order. How do you create a unit whose very purpose is chaos? How do you find a commander who can lead not soldiers but a pack of rabid animals? Himmler did not need to look for a military genius like Manstein or Guderian. He needed to find a sociopath, and in the darkest, most secret files of the Nazi Party, he found the perfect candidate. A man who was not just a loyal Nazi, but a living embodiment of the depravity the party publicly claimed to despise. A man already disgraced, already condemned, already broken by his own perversions. A man who should have been in a prison cell or perhaps a psychiatric ward. His name was Oskar Dirlewanger, and he was not just a name on a file. He was a personal project, a pet monster for one of Himmler's most powerful subordinates, Gottlob Berger. Berger was the chief of the SS main office and a close friend of Himmler. He and Dirlewanger were Alter K. Mapfer, old comrades from the early brawling days of the Nazi movement. Berger knew his friend was a drunk, a sadist, a brute, and a convicted child molester. He knew that Dirlewanger had been kicked out of the party, stripped of his PhD, and imprisoned for his crimes. And in the twisted immoral logic of the SS High Command, this did not disqualify him. It made him uniquely qualified. Gottlob Berger personally petitioned Himmler to restore his friend's rank and honor. He argued that a man like Dirlewanger, a man with no inhibitions, was exactly what the Reich needed to fight the subhuman bandits in the East. Himmler agreed. The problem of the Bloodlands had found its solution. It would be a solution so vile, so inhuman that it would stain the history of the most brutal war ever fought. The Wehrmacht had tried terror and failed. Himmler was about to unleash something else entirely. He was about to unleash hell itself and give it a human name, Oskar Dirlewanger. The name itself would become a curse, a synonym for the deepest depravity of the war. But who was this man? He was not an uneducated brute from the slums. The terrifying, unsettling truth is that Oskar Dirlewanger was a man of intelligence, a man of status. He held a PhD in political science from the University of Frankfurt. He was by all accounts Dr. Dirlewanger. He was a monster forged in two crucibles, the nationalist fervour of pre-war Germany and the unfiltered brutality of frontline combat. Born in 1895, he eagerly answered the call in 1914, joining the German army to fight in the First World War. He was not a rear echelon soldier. He was a machine gunner, a frontline infantryman who served in the bloody trenches of the Western Front. He was wounded multiple times, decorated for bravery, and rose to the rank of lieutenant. The war did not break him, it formed him. It taught him that violence was the ultimate arbiter. It addicted him to the adrenaline of chaos and the absolute power of life and death. When the war ended in German defeat, Dirlewanger, like many veterans, felt betrayed. He did not go home to a quiet life. He carried the war with him. He immediately joined the Freikorps, the violent ultra-nationalist paramilitary militias that terrorized the new German Republic. He fought in the bloody street battles against communist Poles and anyone who supported the traitorous Weimar government. This was where he found his true calling. The Freikorps were not an army. They were a brawling, murdering political gang, and Dirlewanger was a natural. He was present during the brutal suppression of communist uprisings, developing a reputation for extreme ruthlessness and a volatile temper. He was in essence a political brawler, a man who believed that any problem could be solved with a trench club. His ideology was a perfect fit for the nascent Nazi party which he joined in 1923. He was an Alter K. Mepfer, an old fighter, one of the original believers. He marched with the party, brawled for it, and when Hitler came to power, he was rewarded with a civilian job as a factory manager. On the surface, he was a decorated veteran, a loyal party member, a doctor of political science, but underneath he was a ticking time bomb of alcoholism and rage, and in 1934, his true nature clawed its way to the surface. This was the first great crack in his life. Dirlewanger, a married man with a child, was arrested and tried for a heinous crime. He had used his position of authority to coerce a 14-year-old girl, a member of the Bund Deutscher Memdidel, the League of German Girls, into sexual acts. This was a catastrophe. In the eyes of the Third Reich, this was not just a crime. It was an ideological sin. It was racial defilement, an attack on the very concept of pure Aryan youth that the Nazi state propagandized. He was convicted of statutory rape. The fall was swift and total. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison. He was stripped of his university degree, his PhD revoked. He was stripped of his military rank. He was stripped of his job. And most damning of all, he was kicked out of the Nazi party. Oskar Dirlewanger, the war hero, was now an official outcast, a convicted sex offender, a non-person. When he was released, he was a broken, furious man. He tried to clear his name, but his reputation was toxic. In fact, he was arrested again on similar charges, but the case was thrown out for lack of evidence. He was a pariah. This should have been the end of his story. He should have faded into the obscurity of prison rosters and psychiatric files. But he had one card left to play. An ace in the hole. He had an old friend from his Freikorps brawling days. A man who, unlike him, had kept his nose clean and risen to the absolute pinnacle of power within the SS. His friend's name was Gottlob Berger. Berger was the head of the SS main office, one of the most powerful men in Himmler's inner circle. He was essentially the chief of recruitment for the entire SS. He and Dirlewanger were old comrades bound by the shared violence of their youth. Dirlewanger appealed to Berger not as a penitent, but as a wronged soldier. Berger, seeing a useful tool, went to work. He pulled strings. He argued that his friend was not a criminal, but a true fighter who had been framed by political enemies. A plan was hatched. Dirlewanger needed to re-earn his honor. How? By doing the one thing he was good at, fighting. Berger arranged for Dirlewanger to volunteer for the Condor Legion, the German force fighting for Franco in the Spanish Civil War. This was his test, his path to redemption. He would go to Spain and fight the communists. The same enemy he had fought in the streets of Germany. Dirlewanger excelled. The brutality of the Spanish Civil War was a perfect fit. He fought, he led, and he was wounded 3 times. He returned to Germany in 1939, not as a disgraced felon, but as a rehabilitated and proven anti-Bolshevik warrior. Gottlob Berger now had the political ammunition he needed. He went directly to Heinrich Himmler. He presented Dirlewanger's case. He argued that the charges were a lie, that this man was a true German who had proven his loyalty in blood twice. And Himmler, the man now struggling with the partisan problem in the East, was intrigued. In 1940, in a mockery of justice, a Nazi court was pressured to reopen Dirlewanger's case. The conviction was overturned. His PhD was reinstated. He was readmitted to the Nazi Party, and most importantly, he was commissioned into the Waffen-SS with the rank of Obersturmfehr or First Lieutenant. He was back. But he was not just forgiven. He was transformed. His very depravity, the criminal instincts that had ruined him, were now his single greatest asset. He had proven to his masters that he had no moral compass. He had proven he would cross any line. He was a man with nothing to lose and a deep, seething rage to unleash. Himmler did not just see a soldier. He saw the perfect tool. The problem of the Bloodlands required a man who would not flinch at any order, no matter how barbaric. In Oskar Dirlewanger, Himmler had found his architect of atrocity. Now he just needed to find the bricks to build his house of horrors. In the summer of 1940, the order was signed. The new unit was officially designated the SS Sonderkommando Oranienburg, the Poachers Commando of Oranienburg. Its initial recruitment pool was one of the most bizarre and revealing twists of Nazi ideology. Heinrich Himmler, in his perverse occult-like romanticism, had a theory. He believed that German poachers, men imprisoned for illegally hunting on the estates of the nobility, were not common criminals. He saw them as pure Aryan blood, natural rebels who possessed a primal warrior instinct. He believed these men were not thieves. They were simply men who loved the forest, who were expert marksmen, and who knew how to move like ghosts in the wilderness. They did not defy the Führer. They merely defied the old decadent aristocratic laws of property. In Himmler's twisted mind, these men were the perfect raw material for the new bandit-fighting war. They were, he argued, the ideal anti-partisans. So the first 80 recruits for Oskar Dirlewanger were not soldiers. They were convicted poachers pulled directly from Germany's prisons. They were given a simple Faustian bargain. Serve in this new high-risk commando, and your crimes against the state will be forgiven. This was the seed. a small unit of skilled hunters and bushcraftsmen led by a disgraced academic. Had it stopped there, the Dirlewanger unit might have become a mere footnote, a strange special forces experiment, but it did not stop. The Poachers Commando was quickly sent to the general government in occupied Poland. Their official duty was guard duty in the Lublin district, a hotbed of early Polish resistance. But their true function was immediately clear. They were not there to guard. They were there to terrorize. Almost immediately, reports of their conduct began to surface. But these were not reports of military engagements. They were reports of widespread corruption, of looting, of drunkenness, and of the systematic abuse of the local Jewish population they were guarding. The unit was a disaster. It was unruly, undisciplined, and uncontrollable. The local German governor, horrified by their behavior, had the entire unit arrested and imprisoned. This should have been the end, a failed experiment shut down in disgrace. But Dirlewanger had his protector. Gottlob Berger, his friend in high places, intervened. He argued to Himmler that the problem was not the concept. The problem was the location. These men were not meant for boring guard duty. They were hunters, and they needed to be allowed to hunt. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 provided the perfect bloody opportunity. The partisan problem was exploding in Belarus. Berger successfully argued that this was the war Dirlewanger was born to fight. The unit was reactivated. It was no longer the Poachers Commando. It was now the SS Sonderkommando Dirlewanger, the Special Commando, and it needed to grow. The handful of poachers was not enough to fight a shadow war. Dirlewanger and Berger went back to Himmler with a new, far more radical proposal. The poacher experiment was too limited. It was time to open the floodgates. It was time to recruit not just misguided hunters, but the worst men the Reich had to offer. This was the true birth of the brigade. The recruitment criteria became a laundry list of human depravity. They did not recruit from the political prisoners. Himmler wanted the Red Triangle, political inmates, the communists, the social democrats, the trade unionists to rot in the camps. Instead, he authorized Dirlewanger to recruit from the Green Triangle prisoners, the Berufsverbrecher career criminals, and the Black Triangle prisoners, the Asociale. This was a bureaucratic classification for a subhuman menagerie. These were not men who had stolen a loaf of bread. They were the men that even the brutal German prison system had deemed incorrigible. They were men convicted of armed robbery, arson, burglary, manslaughter, aggravated assault, and most notoriously sexual crimes, rape, molestation. These men, the very bottom of the social and criminal ladder, were pulled from the prisons and concentration camps of the Reich. They were offered the same deal as the poachers, but with a sharper edge. This was not just redemption. This was probation. They were designated the 500 men. A man convicted of a crime would serve in the Dirlewanger unit. If he survived, his slate was wiped clean. If he died, he was a criminal who had paid his debt. Imagine the psychological profile of this new battalion. It was an entire military unit composed of men with documented histories of extreme violence, low impulse control, and zero respect for authority. And the recruitment did not stop there. As the war in the East devoured bodies, the standards fell even lower. They began to recruit from the Wehrmacht and SS military prisons. These were soldiers and SS men who had already been convicted of crimes on the front lines. Men deemed too brutal, too corrupt, or too insubordinate for the regular German army. Men who had looted, raped, or murdered and had been caught. Think about that. The Dirlewanger Brigade was recruiting men who were considered war criminals by the standards of the SS. And finally, in the ultimate act of scraping the barrel, they began to accept men from military mental wards. Men diagnosed as clinically unstable or psychopathic. This collection of the damned, this legion of deviants and killers was now assembled. But how could any officer possibly control it? The answer is that Oskar Dirlewanger did not command them. He was one of them. He did not impose discipline in the traditional sense. He created a cult of personality based on shared depravity. He drank with his men. He brawled with them. He personally led them on their hunts. He protected them. Their loyalty was not to Hitler. It was not to Germany. It was not to the SS. Their loyalty was to Dirlewanger and Dirlewanger alone, because he was the only man on earth who saw them, not as criminals, but as assets. He was the only man who could promise them unlimited license to indulge their darkest impulses and protect them from any consequence. He was the pack leader, The monster was now fully assembled. It was a weapon forged from the sociopathic refuse of the Reich. It was aimed at the forests of Belarus, and the hunt was about to begin. The monster was now fully assembled. It was a weapon forged from the sociopathic refuse of the Reich, aimed directly at the heart of the Bloodlands. In early 1942, the SS Sonderkommando Dirlewanger was unleashed upon the occupied territory of Belarus. Their official mission was Bandenbeck-Mepfang, bandit fighting. Their actual mission was terror, depopulation, and extermination on a scale that would shock even the hardened sensibilities of the Eastern Front. From the very beginning, a crucial damning fact emerged. The Dirlewanger unit did not seek out, engage, or destroy armed organized partisan groups. They avoided them. They were at their core cowards. They were not soldiers, they were predators. And like all predators, they sought the weakest prey. Their method was not combat. It was a repeatable, systematic, and horrific formula for mass murder, a procedure they would perfect and apply again and again over hundreds of villages. It became known as the Dirlewanger method. It began with a pretext: a single German soldier shot, a bridge sabotaged miles away, or most often a simple unsupported suspicion that a village was providing food and shelter to the partisans. This was all the justification they needed. The operation would begin at dawn. The Dirlewanger Commando, often reinforced by Allied collaborationist units, would encircle the unsuspecting village, cutting off all routes of escape. Then the hunters would move in. The first wave was not a military assault. It was a descent into pure chaos. The men, often drunk before the operation even began, would storm the houses, dragging the terrified inhabitants into the village square. This phase was defined by unrestrained looting, public rape, and random sadistic violence. This was their pay. This was the license their commander had given them. Once the entire population was gathered, men, women, children, the elderly, the sick, they were processed. The men and older boys, any who might be capable of resistance, were often marched to the edge of the village and shot into predug pits. But for the rest of the population, Dirlewanger and his men preferred a more efficient and psychologically devastating method. They would herd the remaining hundreds of women and children into a single large structure, a church, a school, a large wooden barn. They would pack them in so tightly that movement was impossible. Then they would barricade the doors and bolt the windows. And then they would set the building on fire. The sound that followed would echo across the plains of Belarus. The sound of a mass of humanity being burned alive. The Dirlewanger men would form a perimeter around the inferno. They would set up their machine guns. They would wait, often drinking and cheering. Any soul who by some miracle managed to break through a window or a burning plank of wood would be met with a burst of celebratory gunfire. They called this target practice. In a few hours it was over. The village was gone. The population was a pile of ash and charred bone. The unit would mount their trucks laden with stolen food, livestock and alcohol and move on to the next target. This was not an isolated incident. This was their job. In one of their most infamous operations, codenamed Cottbus, in early 1943, the Dirlewanger unit, alongside other SS and Wehrmacht forces, was tasked with clearing the Pripyat marshes, a vast swampy wilderness. Their success was measured in statistics that were proudly sent back to Berlin. Over 13,000 bandits were reported killed. Of those, only 2,300 weapons were recovered. The math is simple and it is horrifying. The vast majority of their kills were once again unarmed civilians. They refined their cruelty. In the village of Borki, they murdered nearly 2,000 people. In Kotelici, another 2,800. The list goes on. A litany of forgotten names, a geography of ashes. But perhaps the most chilling, defining story of their depravity was their pioneering of the human minefield. When faced with a partisan minefield that blocked their advance, the Dirlewanger unit did not send sappers. They would round up the civilian population from the nearest village, men, women, and children, and force them at bayonet point to walk arm in arm in a dense line across the suspected field. They would march forward until a mine was detonated. The survivors of that blast would be forced to reform their line and continue marching over the remains of their neighbors until another explosion and another. They would sweep the entire field with human bodies. This tactic, this absolute 0 point of human morality, was Oskar Dirlewanger's signature. News of this conduct began to leak. The Wehrmacht commanders in the field were appalled. Not, it must be said, out of humanitarian concern. They were appalled because Dirlewanger's methods were catastrophically counterproductive. A German general, the General Commissar for Belarus Wilhelm Kube, filed frantic, disgusted reports. He complained that Dirlewanger and his pack of criminals were turning the entire population against the German occupation. Their public rapes, their open corruption, their swinish behavior was driving thousands of previously neutral peasants into the arms of the partisans. The Dirlewanger method was not anti-partisan warfare. It was, Kube argued, the partisans' single greatest recruitment tool. Any other commander would have been court-martialed and shot, but Oskar Dirlewanger had his shield. Gottlob Berger, his patron in Berlin, received these complaints and he buried them. He would pass the success reports up to Himmler, and Himmler, obsessed with statistics and body counts, saw only a triumph. He did not care who was killed, only how many. Bandit fighting in his eyes was synonymous with extermination. In response to the complaints of atrocities, what was Dirlewanger's punishment? He was promoted, his unit was expanded from a battalion to a regiment, and in February 1944, for his successes in Belarus, Dr. Oskar Dirlewanger, the convicted child molester, the mass murderer of women and children, was awarded the German Cross in Gold, one of the Reich's highest military honours. The experiment was deemed a success. The monster had been proven, and now it was about to be rewarded with an even greater hunting ground. By the summer of 1944, the Third Reich was not just cracking, it was collapsing. On June 6 the Allies had landed in Normandy. The Western Front was ablaze, but in the east, a far greater catastrophe was unfolding. On June 22, the Red Army launched Operation Bagration, a tidal wave of steel and fire aimed directly at the heart of the German military Army Group Center. It was perhaps the single greatest German defeat of the entire war. In 5 weeks, the Wehrmacht was not just beaten, it was annihilated. 28 of its divisions were shattered. 4,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded or captured. The front line, which had been stable for 2 years, tore open, and the Red Army began a relentless thundering charge toward Germany itself. The bloodlands of Belarus, which had been Dirlewanger's private abattoir, were now being liberated, revealing the horrific scale of his crimes to the advancing Soviets. You might think that in this apocalyptic storm of military failure, a disgraced criminal-led unit like the Dirlewanger Brigade would be the first to be sacrificed, the first to be thrown into a suicidal last stand against the Red Army's T-34 tanks. You would be wrong. The Dirlewanger unit, a collection of cowards and predators, did what it did best. It avoided a real fight, it fled. As the front collapsed, they retreated west, not in a disciplined military fashion, but as a rabble, looting and murdering their way through the ruins of Army Group Center. This unit, which had proven itself incapable of fighting real soldiers, should have been disbanded. Its men should have been sent to penal battalions and forced to dig trenches until they were killed. Its commander, Oskar Dirlewanger, should have been shot for desertion and insubordination, but history in its darkest irony had one last hideous role for them to play. On August 1, 1944, at exactly 5 p.m. W hour, a new fire erupted, this time behind the collapsing Eastern Front. In Warsaw, Poland, the Armia Krajowa, the Polish Home Army, rose up against its occupiers. This was not a small partisan attack, it was a full-scale urban insurrection. 4,000 Polish fighters, a secret army armed with hidden weapons, stormed German strongpoints, captured weapons depots, and seized control of vast swaths of their own capital. They fought under the Polish flag. They expected the advancing Red Army, now just miles away on the far side of the Vistula River, to help them. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler received the news. He did not react with military pragmatism. He did not see a tactical problem. He saw an insult, an act of racial defiance, and he fell into one of the most apocalyptic rages of his entire career. He summoned Himmler and Heinz Guderian, his new chief of staff. His orders were not defeat the uprising. His orders were absolute, genocidal, and nihilistic. The FE Guderian later wrote, was in an unapproachable state of fury. Hitler ordered, Warsaw is to be pacified. It is to be razed to the ground and its name erased from the maps of Europe. Every single inhabitant, every man, woman, and child is to be killed. No prisoners are to be taken. This was not a military order. It was a death sentence for a city of 1,000 people. Guderian, a professional soldier, was horrified, arguing it was military insanity. But Heinrich Himmler saw his greatest opportunity. This was his kind of war. This was Bandenbeck-Mafung on the grandest scale. The FU had personally sanctioned a level of brutality that even Himmler had previously only reserved for the East. He was given full command of the operation. His first call was to SS Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Buch-Zaluski, the man who had overseen the anti-partisan operations and Derlewanger's atrocities in Belarus. He was the Reich's foremost expert in mass murder. Buch-Zaluski was now the man in charge of destroying Warsaw. But who could be trusted to carry out such an order? Who would obey a command to slaughter civilians on this scale? The Wehrmacht units in the city were few and their commanders were already wavering, trying to negotiate. The elite SS divisions were desperately needed at the front. Himmler needed to assemble a new kind of army, an army of butchers. He reached for the dregs. He summoned Kampfgruppe Rennefahrt, a battle group led by SS Gruppenführer Heinz Rennefahrt, a ruthless police general who assembled his unit from spare parts. SS police battalions, security regiments, and Wehrmacht replacement troops. He summoned the SS Sturmbrigade Rona, the infamous Kaminsky Brigade. This was another nightmare unit, a 1,000-man rabble of Russian collaborators and traitors led by the utterly corrupt and brutal Bronislaw Kaminsky. They too were known for being a drunken, murderous rapist horde. He had assembled a murder squad of police, collaborators, and second-rate SS. But he knew one more unit was required. For a job this dirty, this final, he needed his specialists. He needed the one unit that already proven it had no flaw, no morality, no soul. The order went out. The SS Sonderkommando Derlewanger, now retreating in disarray from Belarus, was given a new destination, Warsaw. This is the plot twist of the nightmare. A weapon designed for the wilderness was about to be unleashed on a metropolis. A unit of men who specialized in burning wooden barns with peasants inside was now being sent into a European capital filled with stone apartment buildings, churches, and hospitals. Oskar Derlewanger received the summons. For him it was a reprieve. It was a new commission. It was a chance to prove his worth once again. His men, a collection of criminals, rapists, and psychopaths, were rearmed and re-equipped. They were given flamethrowers, mortars, and a fresh supply of ammunition, and they were pointed at Warsaw's western suburbs. On August 4, 1944, the Derlewanger Brigade arrived at the edge of the Wola district. They were not arriving as soldiers to fight a battle. They were arriving as goals to a feast. They had been given a direct order from the Führer himself, passed down through Himmler: kill everyone, take no prisoners. The city is yours to loot, to rape, and to destroy. The devils had arrived at the gates. On August 5, 1944, the day dawned on the Wola district of Warsaw. Its inhabitants, trapped in their cellars, were listening to the sounds of the uprising. They were terrified, but hopeful. They were Poles in their capital city fighting for their freedom. Then at 7 am, the German assault began. And the people of Wola met the Derlewanger Brigade. What happened next was not war. It was not a battle. It was not even a pacification. It was perhaps the most concentrated, rapid, and sadistic civilian massacre of the Second World War. A holocaust in its original terrible meaning, a burnt offering, a complete destruction by fire. The overall commander, SS Gruppenführer Heinz Rennefahrt, famously complained that he did not have enough ammunition to execute all the prisoners. What shall I do with the civilians? He radioed to high command. The answer came back cold and clear: you know the orders, kill them all. Rennefahrt had his own brutal SS police units. He had the murderous drunken Kaminsky Brigade. But for the spearhead of this new urban extermination, he turned to his specialists. He unleashed Oskar Derlewanger. The brigade, now swollen with its criminal and SS Pinel recruits, advanced into the city. And their first act defined their entire philosophy. They did not advance as soldiers. They advanced as cowards facing Polish machine gun nests. Derlewanger's men did not launch a brave frontal assault. Instead, they stormed the nearest apartment buildings, dragged the screaming women and children from the cellars, and pushed them forward in a dense column. This was the human shield. Polish fighters watched in disbelief, their fingers frozen on their triggers. They were staring down the sights of their machine guns at their own wives, their own children, their own neighbours, being prodded forward by the jeering, drunken criminals of the Reich. This tactic broke the will of the first line of defence. But it was just the beginning. Once the line was breached, the Derlewanger method, perfected in the forests of Belarus, was unleashed on a terrified city. The brigade split into hunter-killer groups and began clearing the Wola district block by block, street by street. Clearing in this context had a unique definition. It meant kicking in the door of a cellar, which might contain 50 to 100 civilians. They would throw in a grenade or empty a magazine from a machine pistol just to quiet them down. Then they would drag out the survivors. The men were often shot on the spot. The women were separated. What followed was a descent into a level of depravity that has few parallels. In cellars, in public parks, in churches, the Derlwenger men, fueled by captured alcohol and a complete absence of authority, engaged in mass rape. They raped women and young girls, often in front of their families before murdering them. But it was the hospitals that became the icons of their evil. The brigade stormed the Wola hospital. They were not looking to capture it. They were looking to annihilate it. They shot the director, Professor Janos, on the spot. They shot the doctors as they were trying to operate. They shot the patients in their beds one by one. They dragged the nurses, estimated to be around 60, into the hospital grounds. There they were subjected to a gang rape by dozens of soldiers. After they were finished, they were executed. The entire hospital filled with the living, and the dead was then set on fire. At the St. Lazarus Infirmary, the scene repeated. The staff and the several hundred patients inside were all butchered. The building was set ablaze. Derlwenger's men were not just killing the enemy. They were eradicating the very concept of mercy. As the day wore on, the system became more industrial. The sheer number of civilians was too large to shoot individually, so they returned to their old method. They rounded up thousands of people, men, women, and children, and herded them into the large industrial compounds of the Wola district, the Ursus tractor factory, the Franasek factory, the railway yards. They were forced into massive groups, 50 to 100 at a time. Machine guns were set up and the executions began. For hours, the sound of machine gun fire did not stop. It was, as one survivor described, a constant deafening noise like a factory at full production. When the ammunition ran low or the men grew bored, they simply locked the remaining thousands in the large factory buildings and set them on fire. By the end of August 5, a single day, an estimated 2,000 civilians were dead, but they were not finished. The massacre continued on August 6. The same methods, the same savagery. They moved through the Wola cemetery, executing thousands more. They cleared the next set of streets. Another 2,000 civilians were murdered. By August 7, the Wola district had ceased to exist. It was a smoking graveyard, a corpsescape. In just 3 days, the Derlwenger Brigade and Rainefarth's other units had murdered between 4,000 and 5,000 human beings. This was not a secret. The Wehrmacht soldiers stationed on the perimeter watched this. Font German officer wrote in his diary, "What we are doing is a dishonor that will cling to the German name forever. The Derlwengers are beasts. They are not human." Erich von dem Bach-Zalewski, the SS general in command, a man who had personally overseen the deaths of hundreds of thousands in Belarus, was reportedly disgusted. Not by the killing. He had ordered the killing. He was disgusted by the method, the drunkenness, the public rapes, the absolute uncontrollable chaos, the fact that the Derlwenger men were looting so much they could barely walk. They were not just killing. They were, in his words, a drunken rabble and embarrassment. They were a unit so vile, so depraved that they managed to horrify the very SS generals who were already masters of genocide. This was their masterpiece, the Wola Holocaust. Oskar Derlwenger had proven to his masters that there was no order too dark, no act too inhuman that his men would not gleefully carry out. His reward was immediate. On August 15, 1944, in the midst of this slaughter, Heinrich Himmler personally promoted Oskar Derlwenger to the rank of SS Oberführer. His brigade was to be expanded again, this time into a full SS Panzer Grenadier Brigade. The message was clear. The Reich was not punishing this behavior. It was demanding it. The Wola Massacre was over. The district was a smoking ruin, a field of ashes and human fat. But the Warsaw Uprising was not. The Polish Home Army, horrified but hardened by the slaughter, retreated to the old town, the city centre, and other districts, fortifying cellars and barricading streets. The fight for Warsaw now transitioned from a genocidal cleansing to a brutal house-to-house urban war. And here, a critical, damning truth about the Derlwenger Brigade was exposed once again. When faced with actual determined armed resistance, they failed utterly. Their advance ground to a halt. The unit so effective at murdering unarmed nurses and children proved completely inept at genuine combat. They were a rabble of criminals, not a disciplined assault force. They lacked the training, the courage, and the tactical cohesion to fight soldiers. Polish accounts from the battle described the Derlewanger men as a drunken, screaming horde. They would charge forward in wild, uncoordinated attacks, often high on alcohol and stolen morphine, only to be cut down by well-placed Polish machine guns. They took staggering casualties. Oskar Derlewanger himself, leading from the front in his typical chaotic fashion, was badly wounded by a Polish sniper, taking a bullet to the chest. He was evacuated from the city, leaving his monstrous creation behind. But the horror he had unleashed did not leave with him. It had infected the entire German operation. The other SS butcher, Bronislaw Kaminski, commander of the Rona Brigade, had tried to compete with Derlewanger in savagery. His men, a horde of Russian collaborators, had also engaged in mass rape, looting, and murder in the Ochota district, but their indiscipline was so extreme. They reportedly looted a train full of supplies meant for the German Wehrmacht that it became a military liability. The SS, in a moment of cold, pragmatic hypocrisy, had Kaminski himself arrested and executed not for mass murder, but for insubordination and looting. The Derlewanger Brigade, however, was different. It was German. It was SS, and its patron Gottlob Lauberger still protected it. With Derlewanger wounded, command fell to his deputies, men who were just as depraved but lacked his charismatic sociopathic control. The unit began to disintegrate, but it did not stop killing. They were pulled from the front lines where they were useless and given a new special task, securing the rear. They became the executioners of the wounded. The mop-up crew for the atrocities. They guarded the staging points where thousands of captured Polish civilians were being processed, sent either to concentration camps or to their deaths. They were in essence the hyenas of the battlefield, feasting on the scraps of the larger German crime. Their reputation had now become legendary. It was a tactical psychological weapon. The very name Derlewanger was whispered in terror, not just by the Poles, but by German soldiers. Wehrmacht units actively refused to serve alongside them. They filed official complaints citing the brigade's subhuman behavior, their constant drunkenness, and the fact that they were a danger to German troops. They were seen as a contagion, a plague in a German uniform, and this plague was about to be given a promotion. In October 1944, the Warsaw uprising was finally tragically crushed. The city was a wasteland. The Derlewanger Brigade, despite its combat failures, was hailed as a success by Himmler. It had done the dirty work the regular army would not or could not do. As a reward and in a desperate move to find any warm bodies to fill the collapsing fronts, Himmler ordered the unit to be expanded this time into a full SS Grenadier division. This was a sick joke. A division was a major military formation of 1,000 to 15,000 men. The Derlewanger unit was a shattered, blood-soaked rabble of maybe 4,000. To fill these new ranks, Himmler opened the darkest gates of the Reich. This was the final, most insane phase of recruitment. They were no longer just taking career criminals. They began to pull political prisoners from the concentration camps. Communists, socialists, trade unionists, the very Red Triangle inmates Himmler had once sworn to let rot. These men, starved and broken, were now given a uniform and a rifle. The logic was pure nihilistic cynicism. If they fought, they were useful. If they were killed, the Reich was rid of an enemy of the state. So now imagine this unit. It was a toxic, explosive stew. Hardened, sadistic Green Triangle criminals serving alongside SS penal soldiers, drunken, brutal asocial, and now bitter Red Triangle political prisoners who hated the very system they were being forced to fight for. This was no longer an army. It was a rolling asylum. It was a penal colony with machine guns commanded by psychopaths and staffed by a mix of killers and victims. This division was now ordered to a new front. The war in Poland was over. A new desperate uprising was raging in Slovakia. The Derlewanger Brigade, its hands still dripping with the blood of Warsaw, was sent to do what it did best. The cycle was to begin again. They arrived in Slovakia in the winter of 1944, and immediately the old familiar reports began. Villages burned, civilians massacred, rapes and looting. They were incurable. They were a weapon that had only one function, atrocity. But the war was closing in. The Red Army was now on the borders of Germany itself. And this Legion of the Damned, this travelling circus of horrors, was about to be called home for its final apocalyptic act. In the first months of 1945, the Third Reich was not a country. It was a casket closing in on itself. The Red Army, a force of pure righteous vengeance, was smashing its way across the Oder River, heading for Berlin. The Western Allies were crossing the Rhine. The Thousand-Year Reich was in its final agonizing death throes. And in this apocalypse, the 36th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, the Dirlewanger, was summoned for its final act. Oskar Dirlewanger, having briefly recovered from his wounds, was back in command. His division was a phantom, a paper tiger, a rolling collection of human misery numbering perhaps 6,000 men. It was a toxic brew of his old guard sadists, his SS penal troops, and the new unwilling political prisoners who were just waiting for a chance to desert or to shoot their own officers. They were ordered to join the front lines to fight the Red Army. And the monster, which had feasted for 4 years on the weak, the unarmed and the innocent, was finally forced to look a real soldier in the eye. The result was a predictable, catastrophic, and total collapse. This was not a battle. It was a disintegration. When faced with the earth-shattering power of a Soviet artillery barrage, the Dirlewanger division did what it had always done: it ran. But this time it did not run together, it exploded. The political prisoners, the communists and socialists, threw down their rifles and deserted by the hundreds, eagerly surrendering to the Red Army, the very force they had been conscripted to fight. Many of them immediately defected and joined the Soviet cause, pointing out the SS officers they had been forced to serve. The criminal corps, the Green Triangle men, and the SS convicts did not desert. They simply returned to their true nature. They did not fight the Soviets. They saw the collapse of all order as one last grand opportunity for chaos. They broke into small, rabid packs, fanning out across the German countryside. They rampaged through their own towns, looting, raping, and murdering German civilians in a final nihilistic frenzy. The unit, as a military entity, ceased to exist. It had been a weapon held together only by state-sanctioned sadism and the promise of impunity. The moment that state collapsed, the weapon shattered, spraying its poison in all directions. In April 1945, the Red Army encircled and destroyed what was left of the division in the Halby Pocket. It was a fitting end, a brutal, merciless cauldron of fire from which there was no escape. The butchers of Belarus and Warsaw were in the end simply consumed by a war they were never brave enough to fight. But what of the architect? What of the monster himself, Dr. Oskar Dirlewanger? He did not die in a blaze of glory with his men. That was never his style. As his unit collapsed, he did what he had always done. He fled. He shed his SS uniform, put on civilian clothes, and vanished into the tide of refugees, hoping to lose himself in the chaos he had helped create. He was wounded again, and in a state of panic, he headed west, hoping to surrender to the more civilized Americans. On June 1, 1945, a month after the war in Europe had officially ended, a man was arrested by French soldiers at a roadblock near the town of Althausen in southern Germany. He was in civilian clothes, but his papers were suspicious. He was taken to a local detention camp, a former POW stockade, which was being guarded by Polish soldiers serving in the Free Polish Forces under French command. The nightmare had just met its final terrible irony. The Polish guards began processing the new prisoners. One of them, a survivor of the camps, looked at the man. He looked at the face, the distinctive scarred, brutal features, and he recognized him. The whisper went through the barracks. That is not just a German. That is him. That is the butcher of Warsaw. That is Dirlewanger. For the world, the war was over. The great trials at Nuremberg were being planned. There would be lawyers, judges, and due process. But for these Polish soldiers, for these men who had lost their homes, their families, their entire city to the beast standing before them, Nuremberg was an abstraction. This was not a legal matter. This was a reckoning. The official records are sterile. They state that SS Oberfuhrer Oskar Dirlewanger died in custody at Althausen on or around June 7, 1945 of natural causes or heart failure. The unofficial accounts, the testimony of his fellow prisoners and the whispers of the guards tell the true story. Oskar Dirlewanger was not given a trial. He was not given a cell. He was not given a lawyer. He was given to the Poles for several nights. He was systematically, brutally, and relentlessly beaten by his guards. He was in the end treated by the very Dirlewanger method he had invented. He was subjected to unrestrained, personal, and agonizing violence. He was reportedly beaten with rifle butts, kicked, and left to bleed. On the final night, his screams stopped. The architect of atrocity, the man who had burned thousands alive, who had orchestrated the Wola Holocaust, died in a dark, cold cell in his own filth at the hands of the very people he had tried to erase. When the news of his death was confirmed, his old protector, Gottlob Berger, was told during his own interrogation at Nuremberg, he reportedly turned pale, remarking, "It is a good thing he is dead." That man was a terror. He was the most evil man I have ever known. The story of the Derlwanger Brigade is not a story of war. It is a story of evil. It left no glorious legacy. It had no wonder weapon technology like the V2, which in a twist would take man to the moon. The SS Sonderkommando Derlwanger had only one legacy. It is a scar. It is a warning. It is the ultimate terrifying proof of what happens when a state decides that humanity itself is a weakness. It was the moment the Third Reich stopped pretending and in a fit of desperation created a weapon made from the darkest, most depraved, and most evil impulses of the human soul.